Son asked me to meet up in public and says he can't step in my house anymore. I'm stunned by his reason. Lately things have been going, well, rough doesn't even cover it. My son Jack, he's 26, came to me recently saying he and his wife were over. They'd only been married 3 years, and just like that, he's ready to walk away. No details, no warning, just we're done. Now Jack's not usually the kind to hide things from me, so right away, that told me something was really wrong. When he asked to meet somewhere public, that was my first clue this was serious. Usually he'd just come over, flop down on the couch, and tell me whatever was on his mind. No big deal. But not this time. He wouldn't even let me pick him up. He just kept saying he wanted to meet out, like he didn't want anyone to see him, especially his brother Andrew. Andrew's 27, and well, he's had his fair share of trouble. He's been living with me for a while now, because he's out of work and pretty much out of options, financially speaking. Anyway, I didn't ask too many questions. I figured Jack would tell me when he was ready, so I just went along with it. We ended up meeting at this small cafe he likes, a quiet place with hardly anyone around. When I walked in, I could tell right away something was really off. Jack looked, well, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He just kept fidgeting, messing with his coffee cup, barely looking up at me. So I just sat there, waiting for him to speak. We did the usual, the how have you been small talk. But it was all tense and awkward. Jack was hardly even listening. I asked him if he wanted to talk about what was going on, and he just kind of sighed and looked away. After a bit, he finally leaned forward, keeping his voice low, like he was worried someone would overhear, even though there was nobody close by. He started telling me about his wife, that things had been off with her for a while. He'd noticed she'd been distant, not just with him, but with everything. Didn't seem interested in their usual stuff. Didn't really care about hanging out or going out with him like they used to. It was like she was in another world. Jack thought maybe it was just stress or something, like maybe she was going through her own thing and he didn't want to push her. He's always been the type to give people space. But then he said it got worse. She started staying out late, saying she was just with friends or running errands, stuff that didn't add up. Jack's not stupid. He knew something was up. He just didn't want to believe it. He didn't have any hard evidence. Nothing concrete. And that's where it all got real fast. After a few weeks of this, Jack finally decided to check her phone. He's not the type to snoop, but at this point he was desperate. He said he almost didn't do it, almost just let it go. But then he thought I deserved to know if something's going on. So he went through her messages. And there it was, clear as day. Messages from another man, saying things no married person should be saying to someone else. And the worst part? The guy wasn't just some guy. It was Andrew. I sat there just staring at him, completely stunned. I don't know if you've ever been hit with news so bad it makes your whole brain just shut down. But that's what happened. I couldn't think straight. I didn't know what to say, what to do. All I could manage was, "Are you sure?" And Jack just nodded, looking down at his coffee, his face completely blank. He didn't have to explain more. I could tell by the way he looked that it was true. Now, to say I was blindsided would be an understatement. I'd taken Andrew in because he was struggling. He'd lost his job a while back, didn't have much going for him. And I figured, all right, I'll help him get back on his feet. I never in a million years would have thought he'd do something like this to his own brother. I mean, who does that? Jack just kept looking at me like he was waiting for me to say something. But what do you even say to that? After a long silence, he told me he didn't want me to do anything about it. Didn't want me to confront Andrew. Didn't want any big family blow-up. He just wanted to walk away, get out of the marriage, and move on. He didn't want it to turn into some huge mess, which, honestly, I don't know if I could have kept from happening. I mean, this was his brother, living under my roof. And this is what he'd been up to, just sitting there, acting like everything was fine while he tore Jack's life apart. Jack didn't even seem angry, which was almost worse. He looked broken, just completely drained, like he didn't have it in him to even be mad. He said he didn't want me to go off on Andrew or kick him out. He just wanted to leave quietly and try to piece his life back together. I could tell he was serious about it. So I agreed for his sake, to keep it between us. But inside, I was burning up. Andrew was my son too, and I'd done everything I could to help him, especially when he was down and out. And this is how he repays me? Repays his brother? I couldn't shake the anger. I felt like I'd been blindsided by my own family, and it made me question everything I'd done for Andrew. If I'd known he was capable of something like this, would I have ever let him into my house? Would I have helped him out at all? Jack finished his coffee and just kind of looked at me, waiting to see if I'd say something or react. But all I could do was sit there, staring at the table, trying to wrap my head around it. I finally told him, "All right, I won't say anything to him. If you want to keep it quiet, that's what we'll do." Jack seemed relieved, like he'd been holding his breath, just waiting for me to blow up or something. But the truth was, I didn't even have the energy to do that. I was just numb. He left a few minutes later, saying he'd be in touch, that he needed some time to figure things out. I watched him walk out, and I just sat there alone with my coffee, replaying everything in my mind. It felt like my whole family had been ripped apart in one conversation, and I didn't know how to piece it back together. I went home later, trying to act like nothing had happened, but I could feel the tension building up in me, like a storm I couldn't control. All I kept thinking was, how could he do this to us? After hearing everything from Jack, I went home that night just trying to keep it together. I promised him I wouldn't make a scene or go off on Andrew, but the second I walked through the door and saw his stuff lying around, I could feel my blood boiling. It's one thing to find out someone close to you is a liar or a cheat, but to have it be your own kid and against his own brother? I felt like I didn't even know who was living under my roof. Andrew was out when I got home, which was probably a good thing, because I honestly don't know if I could have kept my cool if I'd seen him right then. I spent the whole night stewing, just pacing around the house, replaying everything Jack had said. Every time I thought about Andrew and what he'd done, I felt this mix of anger and disappointment that I couldn't shake. The next morning, Andrew came back like nothing had happened. He walked in, threw his keys on the counter, and gave me this half-hearted hey. I could barely look at him. Part of me wanted to grab him and shake him, demand to know what he'd been thinking, but I held it in, barely. Instead, I just asked him to sit down because we needed to talk. Right away, he looked nervous. I could tell he knew something was up, but I don't think he had a clue that I knew about him and Jack's wife. He sat down at the table, trying to act casual, like this was just some regular dad-son chat. I sat across from him, taking a deep breath, telling myself to stay calm. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I talked to Jack." Right away, I saw his face change. It was like he knew the jig was up. He didn't say a word, just stared down at the table, his face going pale. I didn't give him a chance to start making excuses. I just went on, telling him exactly what Jack had told me, how he'd found the messages, how he knew everything. I could see him squirming, his hands shaking a little. For once, he didn't have anything to say. He looked like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Only this wasn't some harmless mistake. This was betrayal, plain and simple. Finally, he muttered something barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said. I almost laughed at that, the ridiculousness of it. Didn't mean for it to happen? How exactly does someone accidentally get involved with their brother's wife? I didn't buy for a second, and I told him that. I said, "Do you have any idea what you've done to your brother? To this family?" He didn't answer, just kept his head down, avoiding my eyes. I went on, laying into him about the disrespect he'd shown, how he'd taken advantage of Jack's trust, my trust, all of it. Every word just made him shrink a little more, but I didn't care. He needed to hear it. At one point, he started to open his mouth, probably to make another excuse or to try to wiggle his way out of it, but I cut him off. I told him, "No, I don't want to hear it. There's nothing you can say that's going to make this right. Nothing." He sat there, silent, looking like he was finally grasping just how serious this was. I asked him straight out, "How long has this been going on?" He hesitated, but after a moment, he admitted it had been a few months. A few months? I could barely believe what I was hearing. He'd been living in my house, eating my food, while sneaking around with his own brother's wife for months. I asked him if he ever thought about what this would do to Jack, what it would do to me. He looked up almost like he wanted to say yes, but then he just dropped his gaze again. I don't think he ever thought about anyone but himself. It was like the reality of it was only now sinking in for him, but it was too little, too late. When he realized I wasn't about to let him off easy, he finally started begging, practically pleading with me not to throw him out. He said he had nowhere else to go, no job, no money, and that he was sorry. But sorry didn't mean anything to me at that point. I'd heard it all before. He'd gotten himself into trouble plenty of times before, though never like this, and every time I'd been there to help him out. But this time I was done. I told him that as far as I was concerned, I only had one son now. I could see those words hit him like a punch to the gut, and honestly, part of me felt a bit of satisfaction seeing him realize just how much he'd screwed up. But even that didn't make me feel any better. It was all just a mess, one that he'd created and now had to deal with. I gave him a few days to pack up his stuff and find somewhere else to stay. He sat there, staring at me, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing, like he expected me to just forgive and forget. I told him, "You've got 3 days. After that, you're out." He tried to argue, to ask for more time, but I wasn't having it. I was done giving him chances. I told him he'd better start calling his friends, figuring something out because he wasn't staying here anymore. I didn't want him around, and I didn't want Jack to have to worry about running into him if he ever came by. The whole time, he just kept saying, "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean for this to happen." But those words felt empty. I told him that actions have consequences, and that maybe it was time he learned that lesson for real. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he knew better. I wasn't in the mood to hear it, and I think he knew he'd used up his last chance. As I watched him sit there, all I felt was disappointment. This wasn't the kid I'd raised, the kid I'd helped time and time again. This was someone who'd burned every bridge and was finally facing the reality of it. I got up, told him I was done talking, and walked out of the room, leaving him to sit there and think about the mess he'd made. That was that. I'd finally laid it all out, given him the chance to own up, and now it was up to him to figure out what to do next. After I told Andrew to pack his things, I expected things to be tense for a few days, but I didn't expect the backlash that was about to hit me. The next day, I was trying to just go about my routine, ignore the mess of it all, when my phone started lighting up like a Christmas tree. Calls, messages, it was relentless. And it wasn't Andrew. It was my ex-wife's family calling from halfway across the world, giving me a piece of their mind. Now, I don't talk to them often, so getting this many calls was weird right off the bat. I ignored the first couple, thinking they'd get the hint, but they just kept coming. Finally, I answered, and the second I said hello, it was like they were waiting to ambush me. My ex's sister started going off, not even giving me a second to speak. She was furious, saying I was being unforgiving and throwing my own son out on the street. According to her, I was picking sides and being a bad father for not helping Andrew in his time of need. I just sat there stunned, listening to her ramble on about how it was my job to be a peacemaker between my sons. Apparently, I was supposed to mediate this whole mess and force them to work it out, as if betrayal like this is something you can just sit down and solve over coffee. I didn't want to get into the details with her, so I just told her I'm doing what's best for my family. But that only made things worse. She went on and on about how Andrew was struggling, how he'd had a tough few years, and how I should be giving him support instead of abandoning him. The way she said it made me feel like I was a villain, like I was throwing him out over some small disagreement instead of what he'd actually done. After a while, I'd had enough. I told her, listen, he made his choice, and now he's dealing with the consequences. I'm not about to let Jack be disrespected like this. If you have a problem with that, take it up with Andrew. I could hear her gasp on the other end, clearly not expecting me to push back. But honestly, I didn't care at that point. I'd made my decision, and no amount of guilt tripping from my ex's family was going to change it. When I hung up, I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming from every angle. My ex-in-laws, my ex herself, even some family friends who had no business getting involved. Each one of them had their own version of how I was supposed to handle things, as if they were the ones dealing with the fallout. Then my ex-wife herself called, and that conversation was about as pleasant as stepping on a nail. She was furious, accusing me of tearing the family apart and punishing Andrew when he was already going through a rough patch. I tried to stay calm, explaining that this wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries, respect, and standing by Jack after what Andrew had done to him. But she wouldn't hear it. She kept throwing around phrases like family loyalty and forgiveness, like it was all supposed to be that easy. I finally snapped and told her, "You're not here. You don't get to decide how I handle this. I'm the one dealing with the fallout, and I'm the one Jack's leaning on right now. I don't care how rough it is for Andrew. He brought this on himself." She tried to argue, but I cut her off. I wasn't about to let her or anyone else guilt me into changing my mind. The guilt trips kept coming, though, every day. They all seemed to think that Andrew was the real victim here, that I was choosing favorites by helping Jack and telling Andrew to leave. It was like they were completely blind to what he'd done. I kept wondering if they'd be singing the same tune if it had been their son getting betrayed by his own brother. I doubt it, but since it was Jack and not them, they figured I was just overreacting. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. I'd spent so much time defending my choice that I was starting to feel like the bad guy, even though deep down I knew I wasn't. But it's hard to keep that perspective when everyone around you is saying you're wrong. The worst part was, Andrew didn't even try to defend himself. He knew what he did, and he was just letting everyone else fight his battles for him, as if he could sit back and wait for me to change my mind. Through all this, Jack was staying quiet. He was staying with a friend for the time being, not wanting to be around the family drama. I knew he appreciated what I was doing, but he also told me he didn't want me fighting battles on his behalf. He just wanted to move on, forget about it, and cut ties with Andrew entirely. I wished I could do the same, but with all the noise from the family, it felt like an endless tug of war that wouldn't let me move forward. A few nights later, Andrew showed up at the door, looking completely defeated. I hadn't heard from him since I told him to pack up, and I figured he'd been couch surfing with friends. When he walked in, he looked like he'd aged 10 years, like the weight of it all had finally hit him. He didn't say much, just asked if we could talk. Part of me wanted to just close the door in his face, but I knew I needed to hear him out. He apologized again, saying he was sorry for everything, that he'd messed up. He said he was having a hard time finding a place to stay, that his friends were getting tired of him crashing on their couches, and he didn't know what else to do. He asked if he could come back, just for a little while, until he got back on his feet. It took everything in me not to just explode right there. I told him, "Andrew, you've burned every bridge you had. You've hurt everyone around you, and now you expect me to just let you walk back in here like nothing happened? I don't think so." He looked at me, stunned, like he genuinely couldn't believe I wasn't going to cave. He kept saying, "Please, Dad, just give me another chance." But I wasn't about to let him off that easy. I told him, "This is your mess, Andrew. You made your bed, and now you've got to lie in it. You don't get to come crawling back every time things get hard." He stood there, staring at me, probably realizing for the first time that I was serious, that I wasn't going to save him this time. Finally, he nodded, said all right, and walked out, closing the door behind him. I watched him go, feeling a mix of sadness and relief, like a weight had been lifted but at a cost. After he left, I knew I'd done the right thing. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. I wasn't about to let Jack feel like his own family was against him. I wasn't going to let Andrew's mistakes drag the rest of us down. He made his choice, and now he was going to have to live with it. After I shut the door on Andrew and watched him walk away, I thought things might finally quiet down. I figured the family would eventually let it go, or at least realize that I wasn't budging on my decision. I'd done what I had to do, but of course it wasn't that simple. The calls slowed down a bit, but there was still this nagging sense of unrest hanging over everything. The family wasn't giving up on their idea that I should be forgiving and compassionate towards Andrew. Even after everything, they couldn't see it from my side or from Jack's. Jack stayed with his friend for a few days, giving me some space to deal with the mess Andrew left behind. But one evening, he called me, sounding worn out. He asked if he could come over for a bit, maybe crash at my place until he could figure out his next move. I didn't even hesitate. I told him, of course, come on home. When Jack walked through the door that night, he looked just as beat down as I felt. I could see the hurt in his eyes, that deep kind of pain you can't just shake off. I didn't push him to talk. I figured he'd tell me what he wanted when he was ready. Instead, I just made us some food, and we sat in the living room, not saying much at first. The silence was heavy, but it was a comfortable kind of quiet. He needed a place to feel safe, and I wanted him to know that he still had that with me. After a while, Jack started opening up. He told me about how things had been falling apart in his marriage long before he'd found those messages from Andrew. He'd tried everything he could think of to make things work with his wife, but it felt like she'd just checked out. He admitted that part of him had known for a while that something was going on, but he'd pushed those thoughts aside, convincing himself it was all in his head. Hearing him say that, I could feel the weight of everything he'd been carrying on his shoulders, trying to hold his marriage together while his own brother was undermining it from the inside. Jack went quiet for a moment, staring at the floor, and then he said, I trusted him, Dad. I really thought he had my back. I didn't know what to say to that. What could I say? I trusted Andrew too, and now we were both left feeling betrayed. All I could do was put a hand on his shoulder and let him know that he wasn't alone in this. The next few days went by with Jack staying at my place. He seemed a bit better each day, like just having somewhere to settle without all the drama was helping him get back to himself. I could see him starting to pick up the pieces, even if it was just small things, taking care of himself, getting back to his hobbies, making plans for work. He didn't talk much about his wife or Andrew, and I didn't push him to. I figured he'd need time to process all of it in his own way. One night, as we were watching some random show on TV, Jack turned to me and said, I'm glad you did what you did. Kicking Andrew out, I looked at him surprised. I didn't expect him to bring it up, let alone say that. He went on, if you'd let him stay, I don't think I could have come back here. It would have felt wrong, like my own family was siding with him. I told him, you're my son, Jack. There was never any question who I was going to stand by in this. And I meant it. Seeing the relief in his eyes, I knew I'd made the right choice, no matter what anyone else said. He nodded, like he understood that for the first time. But things weren't exactly smooth sailing. Word got around that Jack was staying with me. And of course, the family found a way to make that a problem too. I got a couple of calls from my ex's sister, and even a message from her cousin. They were all saying the same thing, that I was playing favorites and enabling Jack by letting him move in with me. According to them, it wasn't fair to abandon Andrew while pampering Jack. The logic was lost on me, as if I owed Andrew something after what he'd done. I stopped answering the calls. I didn't see the point in arguing with people who clearly didn't understand what we were dealing with. But the family wasn't the only problem. Andrew tried reaching out a few times, sending messages about how hard things were for him and how he just wanted to talk. I ignored most of them, but one day, Jack saw a message pop up on my phone from Andrew, asking if he could come by and get some things he'd forgotten. Jack didn't say much, but I could see the look on his face. He was done with Andrew, and honestly, so was I. Still, I felt torn. Part of me wanted to let Andrew in, just to clear things up once and for all. But every time I thought about it, I remembered Jack sitting across from me, saying he couldn't come back if Andrew was still around. I couldn't risk putting him through that again, so I told Andrew he'd have to wait, that I wasn't ready to have him back here, not after everything he'd put us through. Jack took a deep breath when he heard me say that, like he was letting go of something heavy. He didn't say much, but I could tell he appreciated it. For once, he didn't have to worry about being around his brother, didn't have to look over his shoulder or deal with that tension. It was just him and me, trying to make sense of the mess Andrew had left behind. Over the next few days, things started to settle down. Jack seemed lighter, like he was finally able to breathe again. We got into a routine work, meals, even watching some sports together, just like old times. He started making plans to get his own place, saying he didn't want to stay forever, but was grateful for the space to get his head on straight. I told him he could stay as long as he needed, but I could see he was already thinking about moving forward, and that gave me some peace. One afternoon, Jack pulled me aside and thanked me again. He said he'd been worried that with everything that happened, he'd lose not just his wife, but his family too. I reassured him that wasn't the case. Family was about trust and loyalty, and Andrew had broken both of those. Jack hadn't done anything wrong, and he needed to know that he still had a home here. I watched him leave that day, headed to meet up with some old friends, and I couldn't help but feel a little bit of pride. Even after everything, he was moving forward. He'd been through the kind of betrayal most people wouldn't know how to handle, and here he was picking up the pieces one step at a time. I knew we still had a long way to go, but seeing him in a better place was enough for me. Just when I thought things were starting to get back to some kind of normal, the whole situation took a turn I never saw coming. Jack was finally in a better place, staying with me for now, starting to pick up the pieces of his life. And Andrew? Well, I hadn't heard from him in a few days, which honestly was a relief. I thought maybe he'd finally moved on, found somewhere else to land, and was sorting himself out. But then one evening, out of nowhere, I got a call from one of Andrew's old friends. I hadn't spoken to this guy in ages, so seeing his name pop up on my phone was strange, to say the least. When I picked up, I could tell something was wrong right away. The guy sounded tense, like he was hesitant to even bring it up. After a few seconds of awkward silence, he finally said, "Hey, I thought you should know what's been going on with Andrew." Now, I didn't know what to expect. My mind raced with all sorts of things. Maybe he'd run out of places to stay. Maybe he was in some kind of trouble. But what came next was worse than I'd imagined. His friend went on to tell me that Andrew had been staying with him for a while, sleeping on his couch since I'd kicked him out. Apparently, things started off fine, but soon enough, Andrew was back to his old ways, sneaking around, acting like he was hiding something. At first, his friend didn't think much of it, assuming Andrew was just trying to get back on his feet. But then, the friend found out that Andrew had started up an affair with his wife, sneaking around right under his nose. Hearing this, I just shook my head in disbelief. I knew Andrew was reckless, but this, again? I could barely get a word in before his friend kept going, almost like he had to get it all off his chest. Apparently, the affair wasn't even the end of it. His friend said that he'd also caught Andrew stashing drugs in their place, some kind of small-time operation he'd been running on the side. The guy told me he'd found the stash hidden in his garage, and that was the final straw for him. He said he wasn't willing to let his home be used like that, especially with his family around. The next thing I know, his friend tells me he's reported Andrew to the police. Not just for the drugs, but for everything else. "I'm done with him, man," he said. "I thought you should know, but I can't keep him here anymore. I'm not going to let him destroy my family, too." Hearing that, I didn't even know what to feel. It was like a punch to the gut. Here I was thinking maybe Andrew was sorting himself out, trying to find a way to move forward. But no, he'd gone and repeated the same mistakes, somehow finding new ways to mess things up. And this time, he wasn't just hurting his own family. He was wrecking someone else's too. I thanked his friend for letting me know, but honestly, I was at a loss for words. After I hung up, I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to process everything. I didn't want to believe it, but it was all too clear. Andrew wasn't learning from his mistakes. He was just dragging more people into his mess, pulling them down with him. That night, I got another call, this time from Andrew himself. The number was one I didn't recognize, and when I picked up, I heard his voice on the other end, sounding panicked. He barely got a hello out before he started begging me to help him. He told me he was in trouble, that he'd been arrested and needed bail money. He kept saying, "Please, Dad, you gotta help me." Like he expected me to drop everything and rush to his rescue. I sat there listening to him, letting him say his piece. But I didn't feel sorry for him this time. All I could think about was everything he'd done to Jack, to his friend, to me. He'd left a trail of chaos wherever he went, hurting everyone who tried to help him. And now he was asking me to step in and save him again? I'd reached my limit. After he finished talking, there was a long silence. Finally, I told him, "Andrew, I can't help you this time. You've made your choices, and now you've got to live with them." I could hear the shock in his voice, like he genuinely couldn't believe I was saying no. He tried pleading, saying he'd change, that he'd do things differently, but I wasn't buying it. I'd heard it all before. I told him, "You've hurt too many people, Andrew. You've crossed too many lines. I can't keep bailing you out of the messes you make." He went quiet on the other end, probably realizing that I meant it this time. He muttered something I couldn't quite make out, but it didn't matter. I was done. I hung up, and that was that. No more calls, no more pleas for help. I knew I'd done the right thing, even if it hurt to do it. As a father, there's only so much you can do before you have to let someone face the consequences of their actions. And Andrew? He'd been given chance after chance, and he'd blown every single one. Over the next few days, I filled Jack in on what had happened, keeping it simple and not getting into too many details. He listened quietly, nodding, but didn't seem surprised. I think part of him had already accepted that Andrew was on a path he couldn't follow. Jack told me he was grateful that I hadn't caved, that I'd finally drawn a line with Andrew. I think he needed to hear that someone was standing up for him, that his own family wouldn't keep forgiving the person who'd betrayed him. So now things are finally quiet. Jack's starting to make plans for the future, talking about finding a new place, maybe even getting back into dating eventually. He's got his life ahead of him, and he deserves a fresh start without Andrew's shadow hanging over him. And as for me, I'm at peace with my decision. I did everything I could for Andrew, gave him every chance, but in the end, he chose his own path. Maybe one day, he'll come to terms with everything he's done. Maybe he'll realize the damage he's caused and find a way to fix his life. But that's up to him now. I've done my part, and I'm moving forward just like Jack. And that's where things stand. I've got my son by my side, the one who's shown me what loyalty and family actually mean. And as hard as it was to let go of the other, I know it was the right thing to do.